So Howt Green Reservoir was an on-farm reservoir that we constructed last year for Goatham Sons. They're one of the main apple growers and apple distributors in the country, based in Kent, in the Garden of England, where they have large acreages of apple growing spread over a number of holdings. So basically the Goatham Sons replanted or planted a new sort of section of orchards for growing apples in Kent. And part of the requirements of that is irrigation during the dry periods during the summer. And they identified that they had a shortfall of water resources that they needed for successfully growing apple crop during the British summers. And so they identified an area of land that they then set aside for catching some of the winter rainfall that falls on the east coast in Kent, capturing that during the 6-month period, September through to March, where there's a positive surplus of rainfall in the area. That then is stored in total about just under 40,000 cubic meters of water. That then can be utilised during the peak growing season, so from June through to September, where the apples will require a steady, good irrigation in order for the successful growth, for the quality of apples that Goatham Sons need to supply to the British supermarkets and the British consumer. It was a large project for us, so involving large earth-moving equipment. So right from the inception of the site, clearing the topsoil with dozer, excavating down into a heavy clay soil, and using that clay to build up embankments. So in total height, the embankments were 5 meters high, graded sort of carefully and compacted very carefully in order that the water is retained in the reservoir. That will then be supplemented by pumping stations, pumping in water during the winter period, and also pumping water out of the reservoir into their irrigation system later in the summer. So if it finishes, you end up with basically for want of a better word, a large hole in the ground, but hopefully one that will successfully sort of hold and store water during from the 6 months over the winter period, store some of that excess water that falls on the Kent countryside, in order for the growers to use that during the summer. So any standing water has a big sort of wildlife benefit. So there are things like coots and gadwall, cormorants that will feed on the reservoir. But at the end of the day, though, you do have to remember that it is a working reservoir. So the levels, whilst most of the time will be high, the water is actually going to be used for irrigation purposes. So that whilst it does have environmental benefits for some of the species, the key consideration is that they then don't need to pump groundwater out of the ground, lowering the groundwater to irrigate the crops. So it has a big plus, perhaps environmentally, on some of those areas that you can't see. The groundwater, it's all underground and out of sight, out of mind. But it's very important that water is a precious resource that we have in this country. And whilst, yes, we get a lot of rainfall, but sometimes, especially in the southeast of England, it becomes a precious resource that we have to use wisely in the future. And we specialise in a lot of different sort of projects based around water, quite often on the treatment of wastewater, surface runoff, reed bed filters for sewage treatment systems. So we build and manage a number of these systems each year, and usually we try and work in harmony with nature. So wherever we can, we're using gravity-based systems so that minimises the pumps and the mechanical setup for the site. But then using the natural processes that are inherent in all wetlands, which is utilising some of the nutrients that get into the waters either through a process, wastewater process, sewage treatment, or from surface water runoff. But a lot of those nutrients then can be used by the biological activity within the waters, and then that then subsequently means that the runoff from the site, the discharge from the site, is treated to such a good manner that it's then free and able to be utilised in the natural resources, natural systems that lead away from the site, the ditches and the rivers and the streams. And I see a lot of our work is really about cleaning up the water and making sure the water isn't going to be harming sites further down the system. Businesses very much have to work with the bottom line, if you like, in making any works that we undertake being cost effective. And businesses are very much aligned to, whilst yes, they want to make a profit, but more and more these days businesses are concerned about working with the natural environment and not spoiling the natural environment for others, especially those down the wetland system. So whilst we feel we can offer value for money for wetland treatment systems using natural systems, so rather than a fully mechanical system, some of the polishing of the waters, the extra final treatment very often can be very effectively done using constructed wetlands, and that has a huge benefit to the local wildlife, from reed warblers, reed buntings, grass snakes, a whole host of wildlife that specialises in wet marshes, wet reed beds. And very often these systems, whilst their primary aim is as treatment, so that the business doesn't fall foul of their discharge consent, it can have huge benefits for the local wildlife and for the local ecosystem, and especially for those receiving waters, the ditches and the rivers downstream. The cleaner they can get their water, the healthier that river is.